Hey everybody, how are you doing? Welcome to the second half of the sociolinguistics presentation. Um, there is a lot of content in your book chapter on this topic, and it kind of feels like a laundry list of points and vocabulary and concepts and studies. I have decided to pare it down to just a few that I'll explain, that I expect you to retain information about, and that I think are especially interesting to all of us. So, in this presentation, we will discuss the intersection of language and speech and a few social factors. The first being the effects of isolation. So, what happens to a speech community when it is relatively isolated from outside influence and from the influence of other speech communities for an extended amount of time? Next, we'll talk about a famous New York City study in the 60s by William Labov, who is often credited as being the father of modern sociolinguistics. So, his study revealed findings about socioeconomic class that are quite fascinating. Next, we'll zero in on the case of African American dialect, which reveals the some findings about the nature of language and ethnicity. That is a dialect that is sort of pan-American, and so it offers some really interesting insights about the nature of language, identity, and community in the face of kind of nationwide separation. And finally, we'll talk about language and gender, which is a topic that people are intrinsically naturally interested in. And we'll look at research that explores the question, do men and women have different speech behaviors? And it turns out that's not at all an easy thing to answer. So let's talk about isolation. Speech communities that are isolated in some way, um, that isolation has a preserving effect on the speech that is used in that area. And the classic example, or examples that we have from all over the world, are literal geographic islands. So this map shows you Ocracoke Island, off the coast of North Carolina. It is North Carolina, but it's off the coast of mainland North Carolina. And people have been living there for generations. It didn't used to be very easy to go back and forth between the mainland. They were fairly far out. They had their own way of life. And so they had, they still have a very distinctive accent, and dialect that is unique to that island. Hopefully by now you've also listened to the recording of Smith Island in Maryland. And this too is an island, again, off the coast of mainland Maryland. It's part of the state, but has been truly relatively isolated for generations. That is changing in modern times as it gets easier to go back and forth. Kids grow up and make their lives on the mainland more often than they used to in previous generations. So things are changing, and we could say that in places like Ocracoke and Smith Island, those local dialects are dying out, and just becoming, people are starting to speak the way people do on the mainland. So those are a couple of examples of true islands, where the local dialect was just reinforced by the fact that there was not a lot of influence coming from the outside. But there are other examples of isolation that don't involve islands, or literal islands in the ocean, but rather the isolation comes from being cut off in some other way. So historically, an interesting example is that of Quebec French. So 9 million people speak French in Quebec, which is this big region in Canada. And the reason for that is that it used to belong to France, and it was called New France. Um, and people came over from France, settled the area, and the area used to be much bigger, as we see in this map. So this was happening. The French spoken in France at the time was different, of course. That's how language works. So those people got into boats and came over to Canada in the New World, and settled the area. But then, due to problems back in France, there was a long period of time when no new colonists arrived. So the people in New France were not getting new infusions of colonists, and they became, in terms of a speech community, um, like an island. They were relatively isolated. And so for 200 years, Quebec French was kind of cut off from the European Frenches. And sure enough, this has big consequences for the language, including today. And anyone who studied French and then tried to understand the speech of Quebec French, so Quebec speakers, you immediately notice how different it is. And sometimes people from France say that they cannot understand the French that's spoken when they visit Quebec as tourists or something. And we have all of these vocabulary differences that I've listed here that endure to this day. So in Quebec French, they borrowed English words at a much earlier time in history. So they say things like beans for beans, film, fin de semaine, a Frenchified version, and arrêté for stop. Whereas in Parisian French, so back in Europe, they borrowed words from English at a much later point in history. And so there are moments where it looks like Quebec French is more French than France itself, if that makes sense. So stop signs in Paris say stop, an English word, whereas in Quebec, stop signs have the French word arrêté. So that's kind of interesting. Other cases of linguistic isolation that do not involve literal islands are Cajuns in Louisiana. They were cut off for a time, and there are still geographic features for some of these examples. So the terrain in Louisiana was difficult to develop, and so you had these kind of hidden communities that were relatively cut off from larger towns and cities. The German that's spoken in Amish, Pennsylvania, and other parts of the Midwest is quite distinct and has been isolated due to community factors involving self-isolation, right? So these are often communities that purposefully close themselves off to the outside world. And then we have a neat example in this map here, right here in West Virginia, a type of German, Swiss German, that is spoken by settlers that arrived centuries ago in Helvetia, West Virginia. And they were not purposefully isolated, but again, due to the mountainous terrain, they were essentially cut off from other communities and other travelers, other speech moving in and out of that community. And so even today, there are a few people in Helvetia who still speak this very distinctive variety of Swiss German. And then finally, in terms of isolation, we have a fascinating example in African American English, because this is a dialect, again, I've already said, is spoken across the US. And so on the face of it, it looks nothing like a situation of isolation, because the people are spread all over, right? But in fact, it is a type of fairly severe social isolation. And to understand it, we have to look back into history post Civil War during what is called the Great Migration. And African Americans from towns in the South had no prospects, no jobs available, lack of food and infrastructure. And so during the Great Migration, many families migrated in huge numbers to northern cities in search of a life and a job and a place to live. In many cases, they were former slaves. And when they got to the north, they were not exactly integrated with open arms in those northern cities. They faced housing segregation and, by extension, educational segregation. And this is in the north. This resulted again in severe isolation. They may as well have been on islands, but within large urban centers. And this had linguistic consequences, which included the reinforcing of a different dialect of English that maintains to this day. And we know that they were in a virtual sort of island because things like the northern cities vowel shift that affected all of the white populations in many northern cities didn't even touch African American speakers. So it was like we had two worlds coexisting side by side in cities like Cleveland, Detroit, Buffalo, New York, Boston, etc. And here's one example of a map. I cannot remember the date on this. It's not that long ago. Racial segregation in American cities still exists very robustly. And so we see here in Detroit, what the dark red spots mean are neighborhoods that are majority African American. And what this map tells us, and there are many maps like it from many other cities, is that we don't have a lot of neighborhoods, in this city anyway, that are sort of mixed 50-50 black and white. What we have often are these, sort of densely populated African American neighborhoods right next to densely populated majority white neighborhoods. We will come back to features of African American dialect in just like a couple of minutes here. But I wanted to introduce it in terms of the intense isolation that spanned across generations and reinforced that dialect and helps explain why we still have it robustly today. Okay, let's turn our attention to a related issue, which is socioeconomic status. So these things can kind of intertwine because, as we've already seen, certain types of people in a society can experience isolation from mainstream society, such as the case of African American communities. And one distinction that can kind of overlap with that is that of social class, your tax bracket, how much money you have. And so people in poverty experience not only the effects of poverty, but the effects of being cut off from mainstream population, from, again, experiencing a type of isolation that's due to where they live in poor neighborhoods, going to poor schools, and sort of a lack of mixing that goes on. So across America, we are aware that there is a correlation between speech and social class. So think about, in your head, are there differences in the way that impoverished people versus working class people versus middle class or white collar working people versus wealthy Americans in how they speak? So what do you think about that? And in some dialect areas, it's hard to think of something right away, but we probably imagine certain things about how we think people with money talk, how we think people who struggle financially talk, right? Who have been poor for generations, like what they sound like when they talk, right? So we have these ideas in our head. Well, William Labov, our father of modern sociolinguistics, performed an ingenious master's thesis in the 1960s called the Lower East Side Study. And in the 60s, he couldn't pull out his iPhone and just record speech samples easily and then take it home to analyze later. Recording people was immensely complicated, and the equipment was huge and took up, like, I don't know, like a whole table or something like that. So that was not an option. So he devised this really interesting methodology. And it's important to know that in New York City today, and then certainly back in the 60s, people from different social classes were thought to have a different kind of accent that was more or less New Yorkian, which is not really a word, but that's the only way I can think to explain. And I'm not from New York, so I can get away with this, right? So the reputation maintained that different department stores across New York City would reflect different social classes, such that, and these aren't the exact department stores because some of them don't exist anymore, but like the lower class people would shop at Filene's Basement, and there were lower class people working at Filene's Basement. Okay, so kind of this bargain budget department store. Okay, and then like the middle class people would shop at Macy's, and the store clerks at Macy's were also middle class people. Okay, you with me? And then in terms of finding samples of upper class speech, well, everyone knew you would go to the fancy schmancy department store, something like, say, Nordstrom's. Okay, and when you went to Nordstrom's, there were other fancy upper class people shopping there. And moreover, the store clerks at that fancy store tended to be the daughters of upper class families, right? Who were doing it as sort of, for a summer job, or to pass the time, or at the time in the 60s to find a husband, or just for the discount to get all the nice brand name clothes or something like that. Okay, so the theory and certainly the like public reputation was that you would go to one of these stores and it would give you a fairly truthful reflection of the speech for that social class. And so what Labov did was that he went to each store and he would ask a clerk where something was. For example, "Excuse me, ma'am, can you tell me where the shoes are?" And he knew that shoes were on the 4th floor. Now, one really salient feature of New York speech today, and certainly back then, was post-vocalic R pronunciation, or reduction. Okay? So the idea was that the upper class speakers would say 4th floor, but the middle and lower class speakers would say 4th floor, which I'm exaggerating. Again, I'm not really from New York. Okay? So he did this many, 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 many times. He was also a mathematician, or is. He's still alive. And then he would go write in his little notebook tokens, and then he analyzed all of this data later. And it took him weeks and weeks to get enough tokens to have a statistically relevant study. Okay? So what did he find? So in terms of, the frequency with which people are saying 4th floor according to social class. Here we go. Let's take a look here. So, sure enough, oh, sorry. What what these numbers mean are the percentage of post-vocalic R pronunciation. Okay, so this is the percentage of the time that the people responded fourth floor, which is standard, more prestigious, um, quote unquote, fancier talk for New York speakers at that time. So lower working class, so the sort of lowest socioeconomic class studied, um, only said fourth floor and related terms 20% of the time. So 80% of the time, they're speaking with the non-standard trait, fourth floor. Okay. As we move up a class, unsurprisingly, we see an increase in the amount of standard pronunciation, fourth floor, but it's still not a majority of the time that they say it. Okay. When we go up a class, a really interesting jump happens. And the lower middle class group says fourth floor a majority of the time, 65% of the time. So they're saying the non-standard one less than half the time. And then fascinatingly, they're saying it more frequently than the social class that is above them. So it's kind of like they're outperforming the actual upper class. Why would this be? And this was kind of a surprise to Labov. But then he retested this. Many groups have followed up and repeated this study in New York and found pretty much the same percentages and same results. And so what does this mean? Why are lower middle class speakers overshooting the upper middle class performance in terms of standard pronunciation? And the idea from Labov's paper is that lower middle class speakers pay the greatest amount of attention to their speech because of social mobility. They aspire to be the upper class, and they are it's sort of within reach. They can see it from where they are. So they kind of have something to prove. And their performance shows a form of hypercorrection, which is like overshooting the community norm in terms of performance. Okay? Whew. Anyway, you should keep track of that study. I want to move on to discussing African American English. And there are some really important takeaways about this dialect that are important for every American to know. Certainly every future school teacher that's going to encounter diversity in the classroom, including linguistic diversity from students speaking their home dialect. And as a nation, we've done a terrible job at understanding linguistic diversity, especially where African American dialect is concerned. There are a lot of misconceptions floating around, even on the part of well-meaning, educated people. So misconception number one, African American English is unstructured or bad grammar. Misconception number two, African American English results from lazy articulation or cultural deprivation, like a lack of education essentially led to this dialect. Misconception number three, African American English is not even really a language. It's an incomplete code, insufficient for a full range of abstract thought. All of this is completely false. African American English is a completely rule-governed variety of English. It's another non-standard dialect, completely mutually intelligible with English. It doesn't mean that everyone's used to it or comfortable understanding it. Obviously, everyone doesn't speak it. Like every non-standard dialect, it doesn't have a grammar book. It's less understood. But when linguists or the Martians go and study it, they quickly find the systematicities and rules that make it a true language and a true variety like any other language. African American English is a pan-regional dialect spoken primarily by African Americans, but not exclusively. So there are individuals who have access to that dialect and are fluent in it. African American English shares features with other dialects of English, including Southern American English, meaning Southern White English, and even some features with Appalachian English. Here are just a few linguistic traits of African American English. Again, African American English has a grammar because it is a language. All non-standard dialects have a grammar. It's just that non-standard dialects don't appear in official grammar books, okay? But that doesn't mean it doesn't have rules, that it doesn't have a grammar. It just means that it hasn't been codified and that it isn't the dialect that we're teaching for professional and formal uses. So here are some traits of that dialect. There's word final consonant reduction, which is a very salient feature. So essentially, words that intrinsically have consonant, vowel, consonant, consonant, so two consonants in the coda, we'll see a reduction in some cases. Some morphology syntax or morphosyntactic traits. There are additional tenses in African American English. Many writers and scholars have praised and explained these, and even written creatively in the dialect using this range of tenses for creative effect. And one of them is called the habitual be. So in some varieties of African American English, there's a difference in meaning grammatically between a statement like the coffee cold versus the coffee be cold. The habitual be usually is a descriptor stating sort of a general observation across time, whereas the deleted be, the dropped be, grammatically stands for an observation of the moment that is a here and now type of statement. Okay, so those are just a few features. There are many, many more that we could discuss. We could and have spent whole semesters just looking at the history, origins, and current realities of African American English. It is a fascinating topic. If you take nothing else away from this chapter, even this course, hopefully it's an appreciation of the validity of non-standard dialects. They come from somewhere, and they are the home speech of millions of Americans, just like many of your grandparents speak Appalachian English at home as their native home local dialect. And these are not something to be ashamed of. They're not something to wince at, to be frightened of when we hear students speak with that in our classroom someday. Rather, it's just a reflection of normal American diversity. Okay? So finally, let's talk about language and gender, which should impact all of us in some way. It's no surprise that socially assigned gender roles are reflected in language. And some research came out on this in the 1970s. That research is definitely ongoing. It's something of a hot topic right now. And it turns out we're embarking on a massive change in how we think about language and gender. So I'll explain a few of the things from the textbook, but it's quite possible that all this is about to massively change as our sort of concept of gender and the way we sort of conceptualize gender in society today is rapidly changing under our very eyes. But one thing that we need to note is that we we're carrying around baggage or information about what certain titles and statements invoke in terms of gender. So here's an example. If we, out of context, hear a statement like, "The kindergarten teacher has been out sick," do you visualize a male or a female kindergarten teacher, right? And you have no other information. Like, what is the assumption that you make? Okay. Similarly, "That professor is such a jackass." Do you assume that that professor is a man or a woman, right? How about this one? "The nurse will see you now." How about "Dr. Ephraim is a highly accomplished surgeon"? Now, interestingly, in the medical field, this has already pretty much completely changed. So while you might still assume, I'm guessing for your generation, that the kindergarten teacher is a woman and that the jackass professor is a man, probably because of the word jackass, you might not actually make assumptions about the nurse or the surgeon. So when I was growing up in the 80s, certainly we were assuming that the nurse was a woman and the surgeon was a man. But as I continue to teach this class, it's becoming very clear that your generation is not is not carrying around any baggage about that for the medical field, at least. Okay, so that's one area of research in language and gender, word choices and assumptions about gender as reflected in language and using language. And then studies have sought to determine whether men and women do behave differently in speech interactions, I guess. And again, going back to some of these long-term, broad scope studies of the 70s, some findings did emerge that were backed up later by repeated studies. So one seems to suggest that women talk more. Again, I hesitate to be very firm about these, but there were multiple studies. And it seems that the purpose of women's speech is often, there are many other reasons that women speak beyond just conveying direct, concrete meaning about something. Okay, so here we have a very typical conversation about a haircut, and it's just sort of like talking. The talking here in this conversation is not some kind of survival thing in the sense of needing to know where the haircut happened and, sort of details of the haircut, but rather a kind of social bonding that's taking place fairly subconsciously and fairly easily on the part of the women in this conversation. So think about whether any of this looks familiar. And then, of course, the way this study sort of looked at things like that, there's some very complicated methodologies, and they did this over a long period of time. But trying to find men who do this was actually very, very difficult. So if women do this regularly, men, imagine, like men riding an elevator together, one of them just got a haircut. Probably they're just not even going to talk about the haircut. But if they do, it's going to be really short, like haircut, yeah, and that's the end of it. Okay, so that sort of finding is interesting and has emerged over and over again. Similarly, women seem to work harder to keep conversations going, and they are more likely to adopt prestige forms and standard language in their speech. Again, this is not some sort of hard and fast rule, but it looks like women more frequently pay closer attention to their speech and modulate their speech to kind of accommodate the person or the group that they're speaking to. On the other hand, um, many studies show that men are more likely to interrupt in group interactions, such as a meeting, to ask direct questions, to get information, and are more linguistically conservative or less standard than the women. So some kind of opposite tendencies from the women. Okay, so there's just a few kind of nutshell findings for language and gender. There are some very important caveats, and then we will end this video. But I want to say that, of course, biological sex is assigned by chromosomes. It's something people are born with. Gender, on the other hand, is learned, it's cultivated, it's transmitted across generations. It's something we transmit to um, babies and our young members of our speech community. Um, Research findings about tendencies between men and women in speech really only show us large data trends. Okay, so it only works with large tokens for sort of statistical relevance. Individual speakers often do not follow these trends. And so, if you're a woman who interrupts all the time, it's not even, it's just an individual case. It's not something to be sort of alarmed by or something like that. Or if you're a man who's a school teacher, who's a kindergarten teacher, definitely not something to worry about. And then a really important caveat with respect to this textbook, or really any textbook, is that it's an exciting field of study, in part because things are changing very quickly right now, right under our noses. New generations are socialized very differently with respect to gender in much of the world, certainly in the Western world where we live. All right, well, this is a fascinating topic. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't done so already, follow the links to look at the Saturday Night Live sketch and the video excerpt, and of course the sample interview with the woman in Smith Island in Maryland to get a sense of non-standard dialects. Have a great day.